the hall is too calm for the world it represents. An ancient diplomatic hall. Polished floors. Measured smiles. Dark suits arranged in careful rows, people trained to listen without revealing what they fear. It's the kind of morning where every word is expected to behave. Your Excellencies, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen. The greetings begin the way they always do, formal, precise, almost weightless, until the figure at the center makes the ritual feel different. Pope Leo XIV stands before them not as a performer of certainty, but as a man newly burdened by it. He starts where the room can't argue, with gratitude. He acknowledges the one who speaks for the corps, then welcomes everyone to the New Year exchange with the Holy See, an old tradition with an old rhythm. And yet, he breaks that rhythm with a small, disarming admission: this moment is still unfamiliar to him. Not because he doesn't understand the role, but because he understands it too well. He has only recently been called to shepherd, and the weight of that calling is still fresh enough to tell the truth about it. Then he widens the lens. Quick moment: if you love Pope Leo XIV, click the subscribe button now, drop a comment with where you're watching from and share your thoughts. He notes the growing breadth of the room, new resident heads of mission, new diplomatic presences, new lines of contact forming in a world that claims it no longer believes in contact. He thanks the civil authorities who made these relationships tangible, not symbolic. The message is subtle but clear: even now, the world still chooses bridges. It still knows how to show up. And for a moment, it almost feels like the morning will remain safe, just good wishes, courteous words, and the familiar exchange of polished phrases. But the tone tightens. He offers his blessings to each nation represented, and then he tells them why he truly called them there, not simply to greet them, but to speak about an age that is losing its grip on itself, an age where power is mistaken for order, where war is becoming normal again, and where truth is no longer a shared ground but a contested weapon. He does not begin with slogans. He begins with a year that everyone in the room remembers. A year marked by crowds and crossings. A jubilee that turned Rome into a living corridor of pilgrimage, doors opened not as architecture, but as meaning. And a year punctuated by a global pause, the death of a predecessor whose funeral gathered the world into a single, quiet acknowledgement that something fatherly had been lost. That is where his reflection truly starts, inside those recent memories, because they reveal what the world is missing now: a shared grammar for hope, a stable meaning for words, and a humility strong enough to resist the seduction of domination. And once that door is opened, the story can't remain a greeting. It becomes a diagnosis. So before we follow his argument, we need to step back into the year behind him, into the Jubilee's meaning, and into that global moment of loss that set the tone for everything that came after. The year didn't feel like a clean page turning. It felt like a hinge groaning under weight. Rome had carried it first. Not in headlines, but in sidewalks worn smooth by foot traffic. In train platforms that never seemed to empty. In volunteers giving directions with hoarse voices and patient hands. In police lines holding back crowds that weren't angry, just endless. The Jubilee had done what Jubilees always do. it pulled the world toward a door and asked people to believe the door meant more than wood and bronze. And for a while, they did. They came with the strange seriousness that only pilgrims and the desperate share. Some arrived with rosaries braided tight around their wrists, as if the thread could keep them from drifting. Others arrived with nothing visible except tired eyes, people who didn't know what they believed anymore, but knew they wanted something solid again. The city became a corridor. The churches became thresholds. The language of crossing returned, not as a metaphor in a book, but as a physical act repeated all day, every day, by people who needed the world to promise that moving forward was still possible. In a century that treats symbols like decorations, that mattered. Because a door that means something is a rebuke. It says, reality is not whatever you declare it to be. There are passages you cannot invent. There are limits you must respect. There are choices that carry weight. But the year didn't let the city stay in that simplicity for long. The funeral came like a bell that stops conversation mid-sentence. The world gathered around a coffin, and for a moment the noise of politics thinned. Not vanished, only thinned. Heads of state stood beside people who owned nothing but their grief. Cameras panned across faces that usually hold themselves above emotion, and for once, those faces didn't fully succeed. It wasn't merely the death of a public figure. It was the disappearance of a fatherly presence, a man who had carried, in his manner as much as his words, a kind of insistence that the poor are real and the powerful are not gods. The funeral did something rare. It reminded the world that it still knows how to mourn. And mourning, real mourning, has a way of restoring proportion. It tells you what cannot be replaced. It reminds you that history does not move because the strong push it. History moves because the living inherit a responsibility they did not ask for. In Rome, the inheritance was visible. The city that had hosted pilgrims now hosted dignitaries. Streets that had guided the faithful now guided motorcades. The same stones, the same air, the same winter light, but a different weight in it. The ceremonies were dignified. The words were correct. And yet beneath the correctness was a quiet confession shared by almost everyone present: we do not know what comes next. Not really. Because the world didn't pause its violence for the funeral. The wars did not take a day off. The headlines did not soften. The institutions did not suddenly regain their ability to persuade. If anything, the contrast made it sharper. Here was a coffin and a choir and a long tradition of prayer, and outside these walls, a planet trying to solve moral problems with military tools and linguistic tricks. When the funeral ended, the cameras moved on. The crowds dispersed. The city returned to the rhythm of its daily strain. And then, almost immediately, the new year arrived. Not as relief. As a test. That is what makes the diplomatic hall feel different when we return to it. Because everyone in that room has lived the same year, even if they experienced it from different capitals. They all saw the same images. They all received the same briefings. They all carry the same private knowledge. The world is not merely unsettled, it is being trained to accept the unsettled as normal. So when the Pope stands to speak, the atmosphere is not neutral. It is tense with courtesy. Diplomacy always pretends to be a conversation. But often it functions like a shield, words arranged to prevent anyone from admitting what is obvious. The hall is full of that arrangement. Formal greetings. Mutual appreciation. The careful naming of nations. The public theatre of goodwill. He honors the theatre at first, because he understands what the room is for. He thanks the representatives. He welcomes the new presences. He acknowledges the tangible sign of relations that still exist, lines still open, channels not yet burned. But as he speaks, you can feel the hidden question tightening in the air. Is this going to be one of those mornings? One of those mornings where everyone nods, smiles, applauds, and leaves unchanged? Or is he going to name the thing they all keep circling? His answer arrives without drama. It arrives like truth often does, quietly, with no extra force, because it does not need it. He offers good wishes, and then says he wants to share a reflection on times so troubled by tensions and conflicts. The phrase is simple. The effect is not. Because troubled is diplomatic language for something closer to fracture. It is what you say when you cannot say, we are losing our ability to govern ourselves without violence. And then he anchors that trouble in the year behind them, the Jubilee, the strain on Rome, the passing of Pope Francis. Not as nostalgia, but as evidence. The year is not a backdrop, it is a diagnosis. It shows that the world still hungers for meaning, and yet is increasingly allergic to it. That is the contradiction he is about to expose. He does it by shifting the room's attention away from policy and toward motive. Not what should we do first, but what kind of love is ruling us? This is where the old text enters, and it doesn't enter as an academic reference. It enters like a mirror raised at an angle you can't avoid. He reaches back to St. Augustine's City of God, written in the aftermath of the sack of Rome, when people looked at the ruins of what they believed was permanent and panicked. In that earlier age, the panic demanded an explanation, and explanations demanded a scapegoat. Some insisted the old gods had been abandoned, that a new faith had weakened the empire, that the collapse proved the wrong allegiance. Augustine's reply was not, fundamentally, a defense of Christianity as a political asset. It was a correction of the human instinct that confuses divine protection with worldly dominance. In other words, when the world shakes, people do not immediately ask whether they have loved wrongly. They ask who to blame for the shaking. The Pope doesn't need to say, "We are doing the same." The room can feel it. Because the modern world has its own sacks of Rome. They don't always look like fire on stone. Sometimes they look like institutions suddenly exposed as toothless. Sometimes they look like treaties that expire without replacement. Sometimes they look like a war that was supposed to end quickly and become the new weather. Sometimes they look like language itself, once reliable, becoming so unstable that even basic moral terms start to mean their opposite depending on who is speaking. And every time one of these collapses happens, the reflex returns: blame the last thing you replaced. Blame the old. Blame the new. Blame the other side. Blame the heretic. Blame the dissenter. Blame the inconvenient truth-teller. Blame anyone, as long as you don't have to examine what rules the heart. Augustine's framework is merciless because it doesn't let you hide behind your banner. It divides the world into two cities, not as geography, but as allegiance. One city is built on love that does not terminate on itself. Love that can bend downward toward the neighbor, especially the poor. Love that can accept limits, accept truth, accept sacrifice without needing applause. The other city is built on self-love raised to the level of destiny. Pride that calls itself progress. The thirst for worldly power dressed up as security, or justice, or inevitability. It is not always violent in its manners, but it is violent in its logic. It treats other people as instruments. It treats truth as negotiable. It treats humility as weakness. He doesn't present this as a theological trivia lesson. He presents it as a map of the modern crisis. Because once you see the cities as motives, you see them everywhere. You see them in how nations speak of peace. You see them in how institutions justify force. You see them in how societies redefine human dignity until it becomes a word that can be filled with whatever ideology is currently strongest. You see them in how quickly dialogue becomes performance, because performance is safer than meaning. And then, without raising his voice, without naming enemies, the Pope delivers the line that makes diplomats sit a little straighter. These two cities do not live only in history books or empires. They live inside human beings. Inside every person who negotiates, and every person who votes, and every person who stays silent because speaking would cost something. Inside the room. That is the moment the hall stops being merely a hall. The nations represented there do not disappear, but something more intimate takes their place: conscience. Responsibility. The awareness that the crisis of the age is not simply out there, caused by other people, in other places, with other ideologies. It is also here, where language is shaped, where policy is justified, where power decides whether it will submit to truth or make truth submit to it. The ritual of greeting has been transformed without theatrics. The morning has changed genre. Because now the room understands what is being asked of it. Not applause. Not agreement. Not polite nodding. A choice. And with that choice hanging in the air, the Pope turns from the mirror of Augustine to the world in front of them, toward the way power has begun to replace meaning, toward the way diplomacy is being sidelined by force, and toward the way war is learning to speak in the language of virtue. And the hall, full of trained listeners, realizes it is no longer listening to a greeting. It is listening to an indictment of an age. And indictments, when they are true, don't stay theoretical. They move from principles to structures, from motives to mechanisms, from the hidden city of the heart to the visible city of policy. The Pope's voice doesn't sharpen into anger. It tightens into clarity. He is not speaking like a man trying to win a room. He is speaking like a man trying to stop a fire from being renamed. He goes first for the word everyone claims to want. Peace. It is the safest word in the hall, safe enough to be used by generals, presidents, and propagandists without embarrassment. Nobody objects to peace. Nobody campaigns against it. Nobody stands at a podium and says, "I want war." And that is exactly the problem. Because, as he describes it, even those who make war do so under the banner of peace. They promise peace after victory, peace after humiliation, peace after the other side is silenced. They want peace the way a conqueror wants quiet, not as justice restored, but as resistance removed. A counterfeit peace. Peace with glory, in the old vocabulary, peace as a trophy. Peace as domination. Peace as the final frame in a story where violence is the author and morality is the narrator hired after the fact. And when peace becomes that kind of object, everything downstream changes. Law becomes flexible. Agreements become temporary. Norms become decorative. The only real rule becomes the oldest one: the strong define what is permitted. In the hall, some faces stay neutral. They have to. Neutrality is part of the uniform. But the room can feel what he is doing. He is stripping the word peace of its costume and showing what some have been hiding underneath it: a thirst for control masquerading as order. If power becomes the definition of order, then order has no moral flaw. It can be achieved by any means. It can be justified by any narrative. It can be purchased with whatever bodies are deemed affordable. This is how an age learns to praise stability while excusing cruelty. And the Pope moves on without pause, as if to say, once you see the counterfeit, you must also see the system that manufactures it. He names what the diplomats already know but rarely admit aloud: multilateralism is weakening. Not as a slogan, as a lived reality. The great post-war dream, nations bound by common rules, disputes managed through shared institutions, law standing above raw force, has been quietly eroding. Not always through dramatic collapse. Sometimes through fatigue. Sometimes through cynicism. Sometimes through the slow discovery that treaties are only as strong as the willingness to sacrifice for them. In the vacuum, something else takes over. Alliances harden into blocks. Consensus is replaced by leverage. Dialogue becomes a performance of civility while decisions are made elsewhere by those who have weapons, energy, money, or control of information. Diplomacy doesn't die. It becomes a mask worn by power. And the rule of law erodes the way stone erodes, not with a single strike, but with 1,000 small concessions. A humanitarian corridor violated just this once. A civilian hospital labeled regrettable collateral. A legal norm treated as optional because it's inconvenient. A tribunal dismissed because it's politicized. A ceasefire proposal framed as weakness instead of mercy. Each small exception trains the world for the next one. The Pope is not naive about international relations. He knows every nation claims necessity. He knows every government speaks of security. He knows that diplomats carry the burden of possible compromise while citizens demand impossible purity. But he insists on a line the age is tempted to forget: necessity does not cancel morality. Security does not erase dignity. Interest does not convert wrong into right. The hall hears it, and what makes it unsettling is not that it's controversial. It's obvious. And yet obvious truths are often the ones a system must suppress to keep running. So he pushes deeper, past the visible collapse of cooperation and into the invisible collapse that makes cooperation impossible in the first place. War is not only fought with weapons, he suggests. It is fought with words. Because before people can destroy each other, they must describe each other as destroyable. Before they can justify force, they must first rename reality. Before they can violate law, they must make law sound like an obstacle to justice instead of the guardrail against savagery. And in our age, language has become unstable. Words detach from what they used to mean. Definitions loosen. Concepts become fluid. Truth becomes a personal preference. Freedom becomes a slogan that changes its meaning depending on who is speaking. Rights become a tool to demand one thing today and prohibit the same thing tomorrow. Language, which is supposed to be a bridge, becomes a weapon. Not always with lies, sometimes with ambiguity. Sometimes with euphemism. Sometimes with the deliberate blurring of moral vocabulary until people can no longer tell whether they are being asked to do something good or something convenient. The effect is devastating and almost invisible. If people cannot agree on what words mean, they cannot truly disagree honestly either. They can only clash. Dialogue turns into theater. Everyone speaks. Nobody meets. Statements are crafted for audiences, not for understanding. The goal becomes victory, not clarity. And theater, when it dominates public life, breeds conflict the way stagnant water breeds disease. It makes suspicion normal. It makes cynicism smart. It makes the honest person look naive and the manipulator look competent. In the diplomatic hall, where words are currency, you can feel the pressure of that diagnosis. These are people who live by language. They draft, negotiate, reframe. They know how carefully a single phrase can be written to keep peace for a decade. So when he says language itself is collapsing, he is not accusing them personally, yet he is implicating the entire system they serve. Because when the meaning of words becomes negotiable, power becomes the only stable grammar left. He describes the next turn with a grim precision, the narrowing of freedom under the banner of expanding inclusion. It happens politely. Not with marching boots, but with terms and conditions. Not with book burnings, but with community standards. Not with prisons first, but with reputational exile, people erased socially long before they are punished legally. A rhetoric arises that sounds compassionate and forward-looking, and sometimes it is. But it can also be used as camouflage. Inclusion becomes an excuse for exclusion. New moral orthodoxies declare themselves to be liberation, then treat dissent as harm. Freedom of expression shrinks while claiming to broaden. You can almost feel the room's reflex. No one wants to be seen resisting inclusion. No one wants to be labeled hostile to progress. Even the people who privately sense something is wrong hesitate to say it, because the cost of being misunderstood is too high. That is how respectability enforces silence. Not because governments are always tyrannical, but because societies can be. An age can punish without needing a dictator. A culture can coerce by making certain truths socially unspeakable. The Pope doesn't present this as a partisan critique. He presents it as a spiritual warning. When language is engineered to sound like virtue while serving control, the human person becomes smaller. Conscience becomes suspicious. Faith becomes a private hobby. Truth becomes a threat to harmony. And harmony becomes the god that demands sacrifices. Then he speaks the word that modern systems struggle to tolerate: conscience. Not preference. Not feeling. Not personal branding. Conscience as moral fidelity. In a healthy society, conscience is the interior sanctuary where a person stands before what is true and says, "I cannot do otherwise." It is the last line between the human being and the machine. But in an age that needs uniform compliance, whether for ideological purity, bureaucratic efficiency, or social cohesion, conscience starts to look like rebellion. Conscientious objection is recast as obstruction. The person who refuses to participate in what violates ethical or religious conviction is treated not as someone guarding the moral limits of action, but as someone sabotaging the collective project. He gives the kind of examples that land because they are concrete: medical ethics, where the pressure to provide can override the sacred duty to heal; non-violence, where refusing to harm can be mocked as impractical; moral restraint, where saying no to a popular demand is interpreted as hatred. Democracies, he implies, become uneasy when they encounter a citizen who recognizes an authority higher than the state and deeper than the crowd. Because such a citizen cannot be fully managed. And yet, without such citizens, a democracy slowly becomes a majority-powered machine. It retains the outward rituals of freedom, elections, slogans, rights language, while losing the inner conditions that make freedom real: truth, moral limits, and respect for the soul's integrity. The room shifts again, not outwardly, but inwardly. Diplomats are professionals in accommodation. They are trained to find the yes hidden inside a no. But he is talking about the kind of no that cannot be negotiated without losing the human being. From conscience, he turns to the most modern altar: human rights. He does not reject rights. He insists on them. But he warns of a short circuit. When rights detach from reality, when they are severed from the truth of what a human person is, they begin to devour each other. The framework designed to protect the person becomes a tool to manage the person. Rights become not a shield for the weak, but a vocabulary used by the powerful to justify new forms of control. Freedom of expression is restricted in the name of protecting feelings. Freedom of religion is treated as a tolerated eccentricity. Freedom of conscience is narrowed to whatever harms no one, which, in a world of endless offense, means it must shrink constantly. And most chillingly, the right to life itself is weakened, redefined, compartmentalized, treated as negotiable depending on utility, burden, or convenience. When that happens, rights become a language of permission rather than protection. And a society that can talk about dignity while treating life as disposable is not confused, it is trained. It has learned to separate its moral vocabulary from moral reality. In the diplomatic hall, the distance between official language and lived consequence is well known. The Pope is pressing that distance until it becomes unbearable. Because once the short circuit begins, it does not stop at abstractions. It moves toward bodies. He shifts, then, toward those who reveal whether a civilization's words still correspond to truth. Not powerful. Not celebrated. The vulnerable. Migrants, treated as numbers, as invasions, as problems to be managed, rather than persons with names and fears and histories. Prisoners, easy to forget, easy to label irredeemable, easy to punish without mercy because they cannot defend their image. Families under strain, pressed by economic pressures, cultural fragmentation, loneliness disguised as freedom. The unborn, silent, inconvenient, invisible to the machinery of public sympathy unless someone dares to insist they are present. The elderly and the sick, those who remind an efficient age that dependency is part of being human, not an error to be eliminated. Each one becomes a test case. Not a political test. A reality test. Are they human, or are they inconveniences? Are they neighbors, or are they burdens? Do they possess dignity, or do they possess only the dignity granted by usefulness? And the Pope's point is brutal in its simplicity. You can measure whether an age has lost truth by watching how it treats those who cannot pay it back. The hall feels colder now, not because the Pope is harsh, but because he is naming what people prefer to keep in the fog. He is dragging the moral ledger into the light. He is refusing the modern habit of speaking about humanity while avoiding humans. What makes the moment powerful is not that he offers a neat solution. He doesn't. He is showing a structure. When power replaces meaning, war becomes normal. When war becomes normal, diplomacy becomes theater. When diplomacy becomes theater, language becomes unstable. When language becomes unstable, conscience is punished. When conscience is punished, rights become tools. When rights become tools, the vulnerable become expendable. A system. Not a single villain. Not a single crisis. A chain reaction. And now the room understands something it may not have wanted to understand when the morning began. This is not a debate about ideas. It is a question about people. Because the crisis he is describing is no longer abstract. It has faces. And once a crisis has been faced, it refuses to remain a theory. It demands a verdict. The Pope lets that demand hang for a moment, not as a dramatic pause, but as a moral one. As if he is giving the room a chance to recognize what it already knows, that none of this is primarily about policies. Policies matter. Treaties matter. Institutions matter. But they cannot carry the full weight of what is breaking. Because what is breaking is deeper than governance. It is the imagination of what a human being is. He returns, one final time, to Augustine, not to repeat the framework, but to drive it into the present until it stops being an idea and becomes an accusation. The modern world behaves as if only one city exists. The earthly city. The city is sealed within its own borders, living for imminent goods, organizing itself around what can be measured, purchased, controlled, or displayed. It speaks of progress, but often means acceleration. It speaks of peace, but often means quiet. It speaks of freedom, but often means permission. It speaks of dignity, but often means usefulness. When that is the only city allowed to have citizenship, something happens to the soul of a civilization. Self-love becomes a public virtue. Not the ordinary self-respect that protects a person from humiliation, but the self-love Augustine warned about, the love that curves inward, that makes the self the center of the moral universe. The love that cannot accept limits. The love that treats humility as humiliation and calls pride confidence. And once pride is normalized, conflict becomes inevitable. Because pride cannot share reality. It must conquer it. In such a world, the struggle for power is not an exception. It is the operating system. War is no longer a rupture in the moral order, it is an available tool, waiting in the cabinet of options. Diplomacy is tolerated only when it serves advantage. Truth is welcomed only when it supports the chosen narrative. The Pope does not say this with theatrical despair. He says it like a diagnosis delivered by someone who has seen enough suffering to know that optimism without truth is not hope, it is sedation. And then, having shattered the illusion at the level of principle, he does something that keeps the room from hiding behind abstraction. He names the fires. He does not list conflicts to display global awareness. He lists them as wounds, specific places where the moral crisis has become visible in human bodies. Ukraine, the Holy Land, Venezuela, Haiti, Africa's long wounds, regions where violence persists not because it is inevitable, but because it has become profitable and ignored. East Asia, where tension simmers beneath the surface of economic interdependence, and small miscalculations can ignite large consequences. Myanmar, where the suffering is not accidental but systematic, where the vulnerable are trapped between factions and forgotten by those who do not benefit from remembering them. He names them without turning them into trophies for one side's righteousness. That is restraint, and it is not political neutrality, it is moral discipline. Propaganda depends on simplifying pain into slogans. It turns people into symbols. It makes suffering useful. It recruits the dead for arguments. He refuses. Instead, he holds the line that should never be negotiable: human dignity outweighs national interest. Civilians are not chess pieces. The wounded are not leverage. The displaced are not collateral. The hall hears him, and some will be tempted to translate his words into advantage. He supports our position. Others will be tempted to dismiss him. He doesn't understand what we face. But his method makes both temptations difficult. From naming the fires, he moves to the principle that is often praised publicly and violated privately, the law of war. He speaks of hospitals, infrastructure, civilian neighborhoods, places that are meant to be outside the battlefield, even when war tries to expand until there is no outside left. He insists on humanitarian law not as a bureaucratic checkbox, but as a thin line between civilization and its opposite. In every age of conflict, the old argument returns: the enemy hides among civilians. The situation is complex. We have no choice. Complexity is real. He does not deny it. But he refuses to let complexity become a solvent that dissolves moral responsibility. He refuses to let necessity become a mask for cruelty. Because once the innocent are treated as acceptable losses, the moral grammar collapses entirely. War becomes not a tragedy to be limited, but a method to be optimized. And optimization is merciless. The Pope's restraint remains striking. He does not align the Holy See with factions. He does not become a spokesman for blocs. He does not baptize anyone's violence. He simply reasserts the oldest and hardest claim: some things must not be done, even when they would be effective. A civilization is defined not only by what it can do, but by what it refuses to do. And then, just as the room might settle into the familiar ground of rules and conventions, he steps forward into the future. He speaks of the arms race not as an abstract fear, but as an unfolding trajectory. Nuclear escalation. Treaties expiring. Frameworks created in the last century, fragile, imperfect, but real, slipping into irrelevance as if restraint is out of fashion. He warns that the world is drifting toward a posture where deterrence becomes identity, and stockpiles become a form of security that is indistinguishable from permanent threat. And then he names what has changed the texture of warfare itself: increasingly sophisticated weapons accelerated by artificial intelligence. Not as a science fiction panic, as a governance failure. Tools are not neutral. A weapon is not just a piece of metal or code, it is a decision embodied. It carries an ethical logic inside its design. It speeds up some actions and makes others harder. It rewards certain instincts, efficiency, domination, distance, and punishes others, patience, proximity, mercy. When tools become more powerful, the moral demand does not shrink. It grows. So he speaks of regulation, of ethical frameworks, of the need to preserve human responsibility in systems that tempt humans to outsource responsibility to machines. Because once you can kill at scale with minimal risk to yourself, the ancient restraint that comes from fear and mutual vulnerability weakens. War becomes easier to begin, harder to end, and more tempting to justify. The hall, full of representatives of states, cannot pretend these are irrelevant warnings. They live inside the reality he is describing: budgets, doctrines, deterrent strategies, alliances built on credible threats. He is not condemning every government decision. He is exposing the underlying drift, power becoming its own justification. And then he turns, finally, to what he has been moving toward all along, the last place modern politics wants to go: the interior life of peace. If counterfeit peace is domination, true peace is construction, not conquest. Construction is slower, less glamorous. It requires work that cannot be televised as easily as victory. It requires virtues that cannot be mass-produced: humility, courage, forgiveness. Humility, not as self-hatred, but as living truthfully. As refusing to pretend you are a god. As accepting that you do not own reality and cannot bend it indefinitely without consequences. Courage, not as aggression, but as the strength to do what will not be rewarded immediately. The courage to risk being misunderstood. The courage to restrain force. The courage to forgive without becoming naive. And forgiveness, here his voice, still calm, becomes almost unbearable in its demand, because forgiveness is the virtue the world calls impossible until it becomes necessary. He does not romanticize it. He does not treat forgiveness as forgetting. He treats it as the only way to end a cycle that otherwise continues until both sides are exhausted and call exhaustion peace. Then he reaches for the deepest narrative proof the Church carries, not as a sermon, but as a claim about reality itself. Christmas, truth does not arrive as domination. It arrives as vulnerability, flesh, poverty, a child who cannot defend himself. Easter, the righteous one does not answer violence with violence. He answers it with forgiveness that defeats death, not by escaping it, but by passing through it. The point is not theological ornament. It is moral architecture. The world wants peace without the cost of humility. It wants reconciliation without the risk of forgiveness. It wants order without truth. He is saying that peace does not exist. It is a mirage. A pause between conflicts. True peace is built, not seized. And yet he does not end with despair. He points, carefully, to signs of hope. Historic accords that prove enemies can become partners. Quiet diplomacy that rarely makes headlines but prevents catastrophes the public never knows were near. Moral witnesses, people who refuse to become cynical, who refuse to accept the cruelty of the age as normal, who still believe that the human person is not a tool. He invokes a figure whose very name carries a rebuke to power, Saint Francis of Assisi. Not as a mascot of vague kindness, but as a man who disarmed himself first. Who made peace credible by becoming poor enough to be free of domination. Who began construction not by conquering the world, but by converting his heart. Peace begins there, the Pope implies, not because structures don't matter, but because structures inherit the moral quality of the people who build them. An age cannot engineer its way out of a moral collapse. It must repent its way out. Repentance, in his usage, is not public shame. It is the return of truth. The willingness to call things what they are. The courage to stop renaming cruelty as necessity and stop celebrating pride as progress. He offers no victory speech. No illusion. No promise that the year ahead will be gentler. He leaves the room with something sharper than reassurance, responsibility. The crisis of our age is not merely political. It is moral. And the future depends on whether truth returns before power finishes the job. When he reaches the end, there is no triumph in his tone. Only the quiet insistence that peace remains possible, difficult, costly, realistic, if the world is willing to become humble enough to be human again. The hall holds its posture. Diplomats do what they are trained to do, keep their faces composed, keep their reactions contained, keep their thoughts private until the meeting ends. But something has shifted. Not in policy yet. Not in treaties. Not in alliances. In the air. The speech does not conclude like a performance. It concludes like a verdict. And what follows is not applause, not immediately, not as the defining sound of the moment. What follows is silence. A silence that lingers long enough to suggest that the room has understood the unsettling possibility at the center of everything he has said. That piece is still on the table. But it cannot be bought with weapons. It must be paid for with truth. Before you go, kindly subscribe. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release.